I often hear skeptics object that Noah could not possibly fit two of every animal onto the ark. A documentary from the BBC, for example, claims that such a feat would have been impossible. After all, the documentary claims there are 30 million species on the planet. To quote the documentary directly, how could he cram two of every different kind of animal into the ark? At the latest estimate, there are 30 million species on Earth. Even with a fleet of arks, Noah would have struggled to fit them all in. And how would he have gotten the animals on board? Did he personally go and fetch them? Or did they come to him? It's something Noah would have had to consider, especially since he had a pressing deadline. Noah had just 7 days to find all the animals and get them on board. 30 million species in a week. Noah would have needed to load them at a rate of 50 pairs a second. But if one assumes a more realistic loading rate, then it would have taken Noah at least 30 years. It may seem like there's a stark choice. Dismiss the story as myth, or appeal to the hand of God. But there may in fact be another explanation. The documentary goes on to give this revisionist idea that if Noah existed at all, then the flood was a local flood, and that the Bible is wrong about the size of the ark. It claims that all 30 million species could not possibly have been brought on board the ark, and insists that if there ever was an ark, it would have been much smaller than what was described in the Bible, with only a few hundred animals and a local flood. The BBC then continues to go on to make up a story about what must have really happened. I want to point out in brief that the documentary mocks the idea that Noah could have built a wooden boat of the size described in the Bible, based on the claim that a wooden vessel this large would have been unstable. But this completely ignores the fact that the Greeks, Egyptians, and Chinese all built wooden vessels of similar size. Helps to fact check before making a documentary. Also, I'm not sure where they got this 30 million figure from, but it's clear that the folks at the BBC have no clue what they are talking about. As someone with a background in the life sciences, watching this documentary was as bad as what watching an episode of Ancient Aliens would be for an archaeologist. I've seen estimates for the total number of species on Earth ranging from about 3 million to upwards of about 100 million. One fairly recent study put the estimate of the number of eukaryotic organisms at about 8.7 million. This includes yeast, algae, fish, plants, bugs, and basically all life on Earth, including one-celled organisms, with the exception of bacteria and archaea. So this 30 million number that the BBC pulled out of thin air doesn't just mean things like lions and tigers and bears. It also includes pretty much everything else on Earth, including fish, whales, plants, and microorganisms. To put this into perspective, 30 million species of one-celled creatures could easily fit into something the size of a small test tube. But microorganisms weren't part of the requirement for what Noah had to bring on board. To be honest, no one is sure how many species of animals or living things in general exist in the world. Estimates vary by quite a bit. Biologists also do not even fully agree on a definition of what a species is. But what probably happened is that some writer at the BBC used a search engine to look up the number of species on the planet, and didn't have enough of a scientific background to understand that the estimate they were looking at included more than just animals. The figure they were looking at was probably an estimate for all of the plants, animals, fungi, protists, and prokaryotes, including archaea and bacteria. It's also very unlikely, but not impossible, that what the writer saw was an unusually high estimate for the number of animals on the planet. But again, even if that were the case, the writer clearly did not understand what that number meant. But then, that all leaves open the question: of the estimated 8.7 million species of plants, animals, fungi, etc., what exactly was Noah required to bring on board? Interestingly, the Bible actually tells us a lot about this. In the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible, God tells Noah to bring 2 of every kind of land animal and bird with the breath of life in its nostrils. In other words, Noah was required to bring the land vertebrates. Noah was not required to bring fish, insects, worms, spiders, fungi, or plants, besides those plants or fungi that would have been used as food. The one caveat to this cargo manifest was that Noah was required to bring 7 of each of the clean animals and clean birds. These would have been very few by comparison. If we add up the number of land vertebrate species that live on this planet, including birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, there are a few tens of thousands of species, not millions. In all, there are probably about 25,000 species of land vertebrates in the world today. This includes birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. Noah was not required to bring the various yellow sponges, sea stars, crabs, fish, or any of the other many citizens of the deep. He also was not required to bring any of the invertebrates that live on land, like snails, worms, insects, or spiders. According to the Bible, Noah brought kinds, not species, but more on that in a bit. 25,000 species of land vertebrates, brought in pairs, would equal about 50,000 animals. Noah and his family could very well have cared for that many animals, even with the technology known to have existed in the ancient world, and the average animal would have been about the size of a sheep. But would that many animals have fit on board the ark? The dimensions for the ark recorded in the Bible are given in cubits, and the length of a standard cubit varied in the ancient world. But one reasonable estimate translates the dimensions to 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high. To quote the Ark Encounter website, the ark had the same storage capacity as about 500 standard semi-trailers. A livestock trailer holds about 250 sheep. So the ark had the capacity to hold at least 120,000 sheep. Remember what I said a moment ago about 50,000 animals, all averaging the size of a sheep? Based on these numbers, there would most definitely have been enough room on the ark. Those who are hostile to the Bible might not like these numbers, but the math is there. You can check the numbers for yourself. I could almost drop the mic and stop the video right here. But this brings up another important point. I mentioned that Noah was required to bring 2 of every kind, not 2 of every species. In fact, even the concept of a species didn't exist until the past few hundred years. And to this day, biologists debate about what the term species actually means. No one even agrees on what a species is. But then that begs the question, what do biologists, who are on the creation side of the debate, think that the Bible means when it says that Noah brought 2 of every kind? What is meant by the word kind? Kinds, or baramins, are essentially the original groups of plants and animals that God created. For example, dogs, coyotes, dingoes, and foxes are all part of the same created kind. Noah did not have to bring poodles, Great Danes, and German shepherds onto the ark. He would have instead brought 1 pair of dogs that gave rise to all of the species and subspecies of dog that we see today. In the same way with other animals, Noah would have brought a pair of the horse kind, the snake kind, the kangaroo kind, the mouse kind, etc. Let's use the cat family as our main example. The animals of Noah's time were not like the animals of today. Noah did not have to bring lions and tigers and house cats. Oh my. Biologists who are creationists argue that Noah may have simply brought 1 pair of cats onto the ark. These ancient primal cats would have had sufficient genetic information in their DNA to give rise to all of the cat species that we see in the world today. This is different from any sort of neo-Darwinian evolution, which says that natural processes alone can explain the origin of everything that we see in biology. Neo-Darwinists claim that mutations, combined with natural selection, can gradually create new genetic information, like feathers from scales or fundamentally new biochemical pathways. Mutations and natural selection are very real processes. They explain a lot of the variation that we see in living things, but creating variation is not the same thing as creating new information, which has never been observed. Natural selection, genetic drift, and mutation would have caused the descendants of these original cats to eventually develop into what we now know as lions, tigers, jaguars, panthers, the house cat, and one of my personal favorites, the bobcat. So this 1 pair of cats would have become the ancestors of all of the cat species that we see in this world today. Now, here's where I get just a bit technical. For those of you who have more of a background in genetics, if you have 1 pair of animals, then you have 4 loci for pretty much any given nucleotide in the genome. In other words, An animal's DNA is like a set of encyclopedias, and the language of DNA uses 4 different letters. But the letters in those encyclopedias, or chromosomes, vary ever so slightly from individual to individual. That's why some dogs have shaggier fur, or why some people have different eye color. The blueprints between any 2 people, or any 2 dogs, or any 2 cats is just a little bit different. So if we have 1 pair of cats on Noah's Ark, then there are 4 copies of each chromosome. That means that for each letter within those chromosomes, we have up to 4 variations between those 2 animals. It's interesting that there are 4 possible variations and 4 possible letters. Not to be too repetitive, but I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to get this. If you have something like a cat or a dog or a lizard, each individual has 2 copies of each chromosome. That means that with a pair of animals, we have up to 4 variation for each letter in the genome. Between 2 animals, we might have an A, a G, a C, and a T, all represented in the same locus. All 4 letters, or all 4 nucleotides, could be represented between just 1 pair of animals. That's a lot of potential for genetic variation. So when someone tells you that 2 animals on Noah's Ark could not possibly have had enough genetic diversity, it shows that they simply have not taken the time to study genetics, or they simply have not really thought this one through. Mutations, natural selection, and genetic drift would have also played a role later on. A lot of variation that we see in the world today is probably due to mutation. After the animals left Noah's Ark, their descendants would have adapted to their respective environments. A new species would have formed, but there is no reason to think that this would have taken millions of years. There could very well have been just 1 pair of mice, 1 pair of horses, and 1 pair of snakes that gave rise to all of the species that we see today in each of these respective groups. Such large changes might seem incredible. Some people, like Bill Nye, mock creationists for believing that speciation could happen in such a short amount of time. However, rapid speciation has been observed many times by biologists. In fact, it's not uncommon for species to change very rapidly when introduced into a new environment. There have been documented cases of rapid speciation occurring in fish, lizards, and mice, just to name a few. To the surprise of evolutionists, these speciation events did not take place over long periods of time. I've gone into more detail about this subject in previous videos, and plan to do so more in the future. But one thing that I will say is that biologists who are creationists and those who are evolutionists all agree that species change, and that natural selection is a fact of biology. In other words, species do change, and they can change very quickly. Remember, Noah would likely have brought 1 pair of mice onto the ark, not a pair of each of the 38 species that exist today. He did not have to bring fish, and he was not required to bring things like spiders and insects. To be clear, when I say that Noah would have brought 1 pair of mice, I'm talking about placental mice. Marsupial mice would obviously be a part of a different created kind. As I've pointed out in previous videos, God has often used very similar design for animals that are very different in certain ways. Marsupials and placentals often have striking counterparts. Evolutionists attribute this amazing similarity to convergent evolution, meaning that the placental wolf and the marsupial wolf would have evolved very similar body plans independently of one another. But for creationists, this confirms the idea that common design reflects a common creator. So, 1 pair of cats, 1 pair of dogs, and 1 pair of bears, and 1 pair of snakes. When we run the calculations, Noah may have had to have brought upwards of 16,000 animals onto the ark. However, it may have been fewer than 7,000, or even lower. It may have even possibly been as low as around 2,000 animals. It depends on exactly how the calculations are done. But it would certainly have been far fewer than the 30 million figure cited by the BBC, based on a dream they had. Most of these animals would have been quite small, but even the larger animals, like the elephants or dinosaurs, probably would have been juveniles. Remember, if your goal is to repopulate the planet, bringing younger animals would make a heck of a lot more sense than bringing the oldest or the largest beasts on board. But then one might ask, what about dinosaurs? How could Noah fit the dinosaurs onto the ark? Generally, when most people think of dinosaurs, they think of giant Godzilla-sized creatures. Some were large, but Godzilla is a gross exaggeration. In fact, most dinosaurs were actually quite small. The average full-grown dinosaur was about the size of a modern car. But keep in mind that even the largest behemoths started out as babies. A lot of people will be surprised to learn that the largest dinosaur egg ever discovered was only about the size of a football. An American football. Also, some of these so-called species might merely be subspecies. Like how black labs, poodles, and Great Danes are all part of one species, but each represent different breeds. And remember, species and kinds are not the same thing. Triceratops, Chasmosaurus, and Styracosaurus, and other ceratopsians were probably all a part of one biblical kind. But perhaps Microceratops was part of a different kind. We can't know for sure, but we can estimate. At the end of the day, Noah would have brought about 50 different dinosaur kinds onto the ark. When we take into account the cats, dogs, rodents, elephants, and even dinosaurs, the average size of all of the animals in the ark would have been about the size of a sheep, maybe even smaller on average depending on their age. This means that even when we take into account all of the animals that Noah would have brought on board, it would have only been thousands or tens of thousands of animals at most. And when we run the numbers, it's pretty clear that they would have fit quite well. One possible objection that I want to address before wrapping up this video is the notion that if wolves can turn into dogs, then that proves all life on Earth could have evolved from a one-celled organism that lived on Earth billions of years ago. This logic, of course, simply does not follow. In fact, it's a classical example of a logical fallacy known as a non sequitur. Biologists who are creationists and those who are evolutionists agree that species change. That has never been a point of debate. In fact, it was originally a creationist by the name of Edward Blyth who first proposed the idea of natural selection, not Charles Darwin. The nature of the debate ever since the time of Darwin has been about how much species change, not if species change. Evolutionists and textbooks will usually tell people that creationists deny that species change. But this is simply not the case. It may or may not be intentional, but this claim is nothing more than a gross misrepresentation of the creationist perspective. At this point, someone might object. But my biology textbook says that evolution just means change over time, or shift in allele frequencies. Again, evolutionists are inconsistent on their definition of the word evolution. Creationists and evolutionists both agree that species change, but evolutionists will typically define evolution as simply change over time, and then switch to using the word evolution to convey the idea that all life arose from a universal common ancestor with no outside intelligence guiding the process. It's an equivocation fallacy, where two very different concepts are lumped together as if they are one and the same. It's also a bait-and-switch tactic, where evolution is defined one way, and then used with a completely different meaning. Textbooks will define evolution as change over time, and then switch to a completely different definition without informing the reader. I've gone into this in more detail in my previous videos, and will almost certainly cover this concept in the future. But for now, it's one thing to say that lions, tigers, jaguars, and house cats are all related. The basic anatomy and biochemistry is already there. But it's quite another to say that a single-celled organism could have given rise to all of the life that we see in the world today. In closing, those who are hostile, or even those who are just honestly skeptical of the Bible, will often ask how it was possible for Noah to have fit all of those millions of species onto that one tiny little boat. But when we take into account the actual dimensions of the ark, the fact that ancient people used to build wooden vessels of similar size, and the fact that God only told Noah to bring the land vertebrates, we see that fitting the animals on board would not have been a problem. A few thousand or a few tens of thousands of animals would have fit just fine into an ark of that size, leaving plenty of room for food, supplies, and even people. But then one might ask, if Noah did not bring the fish or the invertebrates that live on land, how could they have possibly survived the flood? That will be the topic of my next video. Sadly, many people died in the flood because they chose to reject God's provision of salvation from the flood, just as many choose to reject the provision of salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. There is an interesting parallel in these situations. God gave humanity a wooden ark, an ark with 3 decks, but only one door to enter to receive salvation. The Bible also reveals God as a Trinity, 3 persons in one being. God gave his Son, the eternal second member of the Trinity, to die on a wooden cross, paying the penalty of the sin of the first man, Adam, and all of humanity, so that we could enter into salvation through him. Jesus revealed himself as the only means by which man could be saved. No blood sacrifice of animals, and no amount of good deeds, could wipe away our crimes against our Creator. Death is the penalty for sin, and that's why when the first man, Adam, sinned, he brought death into the world. And that's why Jesus had to shed his blood and die a physical death on the cross. Those of us who accept his sacrifice and embrace the gospel will one day be resurrected and live in eternity with him, while those who choose to reject his sacrifice will be resurrected to eternal damnation. Buddha cannot save you. Good deeds cannot save you. Muhammad cannot save you, and did not even know if he himself were saved, but instead was terrified that he was possessed by demons and that he was going to hell. How can a true prophet not even know of his own salvation? Jesus said that it is only by him that we are saved. Notice that he said that it was him who saves us, not merely his message. Men will only be saved through the finished work of Jesus Christ, and by no other name or deed.